It begins with silence. Not the kind that follows noise, but the deep, humming quiet that exists far below the surface of America's largest lake. If you could descend through that cold, weighty blue, past the last flicker of daylight and into the pressure-bent dark, you'd find shapes that shouldn't be there, roof lines, stone walls, streets that lead nowhere. A place once called Altona County. Today, tourists skim its surface in fishing boats and vacation cruisers, never realizing there's a drowned county beneath them. An entire American community erased by rising water, official orders, and the kind of paperwork that only governments know how to hide. This is the story of that county. The people who lived there, the dam that took it, and the silence that followed. The modern shoreline of Lake Superior stretches so far. It feels endless. A body of water so vast, it can make its own weather. On most maps, it looks untouched, an ancient wilderness dividing the United States and Canada. But if you look closer, buried in historical plats from the early 1900s, there's a vanished name along its southern rim: Altona County. It existed for barely half a century, founded in 1883 by lumber families and iron prospectors who believed the northern frontier could be tamed. The land was rich in hardwood and ore. The rivers that threaded through it, particularly the Altona River, were the kind engineers loved. Steep, fast, and perfect for hydroelectric dreams. For decades, settlers hauled their lives through dense pine forests and glacial valleys. They built mills, schools, a brick courthouse, even a railway spur that curved toward the lake. By 1910, Altona had 7 towns, 3 post offices, and the smell of sawdust in the air. Then came the war. The First World War changed what America needed. Timber shifted from frontier business to federal priority. The U.S. Forest Service began marking tracts for conservation, while new companies scouted the region for power projects. The Altona River, running like a silver spine through Altona, caught their eye. Among those companies was North Hydroelectric and Light Company, a Minneapolis-based firm led by a man named Walter Caraway, a visionary or opportunist, depending who you asked. Caraway had a plan to tame the Altona and feed power all the way to Duluth. His proposal was simple: dam the river's mouth, flood the valley, and create a reservoir that could outlast generations. Locals didn't understand the scale. No one did. To them, the idea of a dam was progress. Caraway promised jobs, better roads, and something called federal partnership. In 1918, as the war ended, the county voted narrowly to approve the initial survey. That vote sealed its fate. The first winter after approval was brutal. Ice thickened over the Altona until men could walk from one bank to another. Surveyors stamped their boots, drove iron stakes into the snow, and mapped everything in red grease pencil. They marked farmhouses, churches, even cemeteries. When questioned, they said the markings were for future records. By spring 1919, the project became official. The federal government, through the Army Corps of Engineers, declared the Altona River Valley a zone of national infrastructure significance. Behind that sterile phrase hid an ugly reality: eminent domain. Families received letters printed on cream paper bearing the Corps seal. Each notice began the same way: to the occupants of the following parcel. It offered a valuation, usually less than what the land could fetch privately, and a relocation stipend. few fought back. Those who did discovered the courts had already sided with Washington. By 1922, the first exodus began. The county seat, Belford, tried to resist. Its mayor, Henry LaRue, petitioned the state to halt the project, arguing that flooding would destroy tax revenue and displace over 100 people. Newspapers from Marquette to Green Bay ran editorials about the lake that will eat a county. But by then, the machinery was already rolling north. Caraway's company broke ground that summer. Steam shovels arrived on rail cars, followed by hundreds of laborers, mostly immigrants from Finland and Croatia, drawn by high wages and the promise of steady work. Temporary camps sprouted along the valley, canvas cities lit by kerosene and filled with the metallic ring of hammers. Locals watched as forests fell. Trees that had stood for centuries went down in minutes. Dynamite reshaped cliffs. By autumn, the Altona River no longer sounded like water. It sounded like war. There's a photograph from 1924. It shows a church steeple rising above a sea of stumps, the rest of the town gone. The caption reads simply, "Altona Falls, pre-inundation phase." In the archives of the Michigan Historical Society, you can still read letters from families forced to leave. One woman, Mabel Rowe, wrote to her sister in Saginaw, "They say the water will reach the steps by Christmas. I can't think of our father's grave down there. They promised to move them, but no one's come yet. The nights are quiet except for the drills. The men joke that the county will be the world's biggest fish pond." Her letter was never answered. By the winter of 1925, the dam, named the Caraway Hydroelectric Barrier, stood nearly complete. It was a concrete wall spanning nearly 600 feet, with spillways as tall as buildings. Engineers estimated the reservoir would stretch across 130 square miles, swallowing valleys, farms, and nearly every town except a few high-ridge communities. The dedication ceremony was held in March 1926. Photographs show Caraway in a wool coat, shaking hands with federal officials, while behind them, the dam loomed like a gray mountain. He told reporters the project was a triumph of man over geography. 2 months later, the gates closed. At first, the flooding was slow. The Altona River backed up, gently, filling its tributaries and glimmering in the spring sun. But by mid-June, rain arrived, heavy and relentless. Locals said the heavens wanted their county back. Within weeks, the water had risen 30 feet. Barn roofs disappeared, fences vanished under ripples, and fish swam through what used to be cornfields. Entire houses creaked and lifted, floating away until they broke apart. Belford's courthouse was one of the last to fall. Reporters described how its clock tower struck noon for the final time as water reached the second-floor windows. Someone said they could still hear the chime echo beneath the surface days later. By August, Altona County was gone. On paper, it simply ceased to exist. State legislators voted to dissolve its charter, transferring remaining assets to neighboring jurisdictions. For a brief moment, the Detroit Free Press ran the headline, "An American County Drowns by Design." Then, silence. Decades passed. The reservoir, now officially part of Lake Superior's regulated system, became a source of hydroelectric power and regional pride. Locals called it Lake Altona Basin, though maps quietly merged it into the greater Superior shoreline. Fishing boomed. Resorts opened. No one spoke of Altona anymore, except one man, In 1957, a diver named Ray Bennick claimed he found brick roads and intact buildings nearly 100 feet down near the old Altona River mouth. His statements drew ridicule. The Corps of Engineers insisted no structures remained. Everything had been cleared to bedrock. Newspapers printed Bennick's claims under the headline, "Myth of the Drowned County." But Bennick was persistent. He returned with a crude, unemployed underwater camera, a Navy surplus box fitted with glass plates, and captured 6 blurry images. One appeared to show a steeple, another a schoolhouse. The negatives were confiscated after he attempted to sell them to a local TV station. Officially, they were lost in transit. For years, whispers surrounded the lake. Fishermen reported snagging nets on square rocks far from shore. A logging barge operator said sonar showed ghost lines beneath the silt, rectangles too regular to be natural. In 1973, an environmental survey funded by the University of Michigan accidentally rediscovered the truth. Researchers studying mercury levels sent divers to collect sediment samples. What they found wasn't just mud. It was brick, glass, and fragments of porcelain street lamps. They also found a sign, preserved in silt. "Welcome to Belford, population 1,213. The discovery made brief news. Local TV ran grainy footage of the sign being raised onto a boat deck. Viewers were astonished. For a week, people asked how a whole county could vanish underwater without anyone remembering. Then, abruptly, coverage stopped. When the university requested permission for further dives, the Army Corps denied it, citing safety concerns and structural hazards. The Belford sign disappeared from the university archives months later. The researcher who led the dive, Dr. Elaine Morton, left academia shortly afterward. Her notes, however, survived in private hands. Among them is a chilling line dated August 5, 1973. "If our findings are accurate, the valley was not fully cleared before inundation. Structural remains suggest hurried evacuation. Some locations still contain household artifacts." In plain language, that meant people might have been left behind. No one investigated further. By the 1980s, Lake Altona Basin had become a postcard destination. Blue water framed by pine and granite. Few visitors knew they were boating above what locals quietly called the Second Atlantis. That same decade, a retired Corps clerk named Howard Briggs began writing letters to state representatives. Briggs claimed he had seen relocation ledgers from 1924 that listed fewer evacuations than households. According to him, dozens of families simply vanished from the record. Briggs's letters were ignored, then dismissed as the ramblings of an old bureaucrat. He died in 1987. His papers surfaced only in 2002, when a relative donated them to a regional museum. Inside one envelope, archivists found a typed memo stamped "Confidential. Internal review only." It read, "Recommend suppression of all material pertaining to residual habitation in Zone 3 prior to closure. Disclosure may constitute liability." Zone 3 referred to Belford. If you stand on the modern shore today, on the overlook above Caraway Dam, named for the man who started it all, you can still see the faint outlines of the old river's path beneath the surface when the sun hits at the right angle. Locals say that on certain nights, when the turbines slow and the lake is still, you can hear faint bells under the water. Tour guides dismiss it as imagination, but sound travels strangely through pressure and distance. And beneath that glass-cold expanse, lie foundations that once held lives, laughter, and the stubbornness of a county that never agreed to die. The records of Altona County remain scattered, some in state vaults, some mislabeled under different jurisdictions, some missing entirely. The dam's blueprints still exist, stamped and signed, but the clearance completion document, the proof that every structure was demolished before flooding, has never been found. Some historians argue it never existed. Others believe it was destroyed deliberately after a flood incident in 1927 threatened to expose what was left below. Whatever the truth, one thing remains. Altona wasn't lost by accident. It was buried beneath policy, paperwork, and 400 feet of water. And the lake still holds what the archives refuse to show. The deeper you go into the story of Altona County, the harder it becomes to separate what's buried underwater from what's buried in the record. The files are incomplete, the maps are inconsistent, and the testimonies, scattered across generations, read more like ghost stories than history. But every mystery leaves a paper trail, and this one starts in a forgotten cabinet in Lansing, Michigan. In 2004, a freelance journalist named Thomas Kincaid was researching a feature on vanished towns of the Midwest. He'd grown up near the Superior shoreline and remembered stories about the lake that swallowed a county. He expected folklore. Instead, he found something else. At the Michigan State Archives, a clerk brought him a mislabeled box marked Altona Co. Tax records, 1925. Inside were ledgers so water-stained they looked fossilized, but tucked between them was a manila envelope stamped, "Property of U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, not for public distribution." The envelope contained 46 pages, typed memos, telegrams, and field reports. One, dated March 2, 1926, 2 months before the dam's floodgates closed, read, "Evacuation of Belford incomplete. 14 families have not confirmed departure. Survey team requests delay of final closure." It was signed by Lieutenant Harold D. Pierce, Corps Field Engineer. Pierce's name appears nowhere else in public records after that date. Kincaid published excerpts online under the headline, "The County the Government Forgot to Move." His article spread quickly across message boards dedicated to American infrastructure history. But within a week, the post was taken down. The hosting domain cited copyright complaint by a federal entity. Kincaid tried appealing, then disappeared from public view. Friends said he left for Duluth, working odd jobs near the docks. 3 years later, his car was found abandoned in a parking lot overlooking the lake. Inside was his camera and a soaked notebook. The last line, still legible, read, "Pierce warned them. Nobody listened. The water was faster than they thought." To understand that line, you have to understand what Altona represented in its final months. By early 1926, the valley was a construction zone. Crews dynamited shale to redirect tributaries, while residents still lived in their houses. There were delays, labor strikes, mechanical failures, legal protests. The Corps had promised a full year for relocation. Instead, pressure from Washington accelerated the timetable. Documents from the era show how funding was tied to post-war energy quotas. The government wanted hydroelectric capacity online before winter 1926 to supply regional munitions plants. In simple terms, the dam couldn't wait for the people. In Pierce's letters, later recovered through private collectors. He wrote that Caraway's company cut corners to meet deadlines. One passage reads, "Clearance teams have not reached Zone 3 due to washout of access road. Families remain near Riverbend. Explosives set to detonate by June 14th. Closure scheduled July 1st. Unacceptable overlap." That memo was forwarded to the Corps' regional office. Someone underlined "unacceptable overlap" and scrawled in pencil, "Proceed regardless, risk minimal." Within weeks, the valley flooded. Historians who've studied the event estimate nearly 1/10 structures were submerged, but fewer than 1/10 were officially demolished. That leaves hundreds unaccounted for. Whether those buildings still exist below the lake isn't the question. It's whether some were occupied when the water came. A chilling possibility supported by one overlooked artifact: the Belford Ledger. During a 1983 dredging project near Caraway Dam, workers recovered a rusted metal safe. Inside were fragments of documents, including one intact page from Belford's courthouse registry. It lists 26 names under the heading "Relocation Confirmations Pending." The date, June 10, 1926. 2 weeks before the dam sealed. No corresponding confirmed relocated entries were ever filed. In 2009, a graduate student named Rachel Hensley revisited the story for her master's thesis at the University of Wisconsin. Her focus: how federal infrastructure projects displaced rural communities in early 20th century America. Her paper included a short section on Altona, but what made it remarkable were her field notes. Hensley had conducted interviews with descendants of original residents, families who'd fled Belford and surrounding towns. One of them was Edward LaRue, grandson of the last mayor. He lived in a clapboard house overlooking the lake. His recollections, preserved on tape, are rough but clear. "My grandfather used to say the dam came early. He was supposed to move last. He said the water started rising before the last train left. They blew the whistle 3 times. That meant everyone out. But some folks didn't make it. The bridge washed out, and the Corps men never went back." Hensley cross-referenced LaRue's account with a local newspaper clipping from July 4, 1926. "Flooding progresses faster than projected. Reports of livestock stranded on Northern Ridge. Evacuation crews ordered to stand down." Her conclusion was restrained but haunting. Evidence suggests the final evacuation of Altona County was incomplete. The accelerated schedule, combined with communication breakdowns and heavy rainfall, likely resulted in loss of life unrecorded in official tallies. Hensley submitted her thesis in May 2010. 2 weeks later, the university received a letter from the U.S. Army Corps requesting the redaction of classified historical material. The thesis was removed from digital archives. What made the government so nervous about a submerged county from 80 years ago? To answer that, you have to look at the economics behind Caraway's project. By 1925, North Hydroelectric was nearly bankrupt. Overruns, labor disputes, and lawsuits had bled the company dry. The only thing keeping it afloat was its federal contract. The court had guaranteed payment upon timely completion. Every delay meant financial collapse. Caraway's private letters, some later auctioned in estate sales, reveal mounting desperation. In one, he wrote to his investors, "If we do not achieve operational status by Q3, the creditors will dismantle us. The government requires power delivery by autumn. We must deliver, whatever the cost." When workers complained about rushing demolition crews, Caraway reportedly told them, "Once the water's up, no one will care what's under it." That line, repeated by several surviving witnesses, became the project's epitaph. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker named Grant Holloway set out to rediscover what remained below the lake. He'd heard of the Altona legend from a fisherman while filming near Duluth. Holloway specialized in cold water explorations, wrecks, mines, underwater ghost towns. He assembled a small crew and obtained a research permit under the guise of studying industrial heritage. They launched from the southern shore in late August. Using modern sonar, they mapped the basin. What appeared on their screens stunned them. At a depth of 160 feet, amid silt and debris, were linear patterns, streets, foundations, rectangular blocks, aligned with uncanny precision. One image clearly showed a bell tower. Another revealed rail ties buried in sediment. The footage should have made headlines. Instead, the team was met at the dock by local authorities and ordered to surrender their tapes. Holloway's log notes that two men in plain clothes presented federal credentials. The tapes were seized for review. 3 days later, Holloway received a formal notice. His permit was revoked due to unauthorized exploration of restricted hydrological infrastructure. He later uploaded a 30-second teaser online before the video vanished. In that clip, a distorted voice, possibly his, says, "We found the streets. They're still there." To this day, Holloway refuses interviews. He lives quietly in northern Wisconsin, describing the experience as the closest I've ever come to history reaching back at me. When pressed by researchers, he mentioned one more detail. During their final dive, the team's depth sensors malfunctioned. The readings jumped erratically, suggesting a hollow cavity beneath the lakebed, something like an underground chamber or air pocket. Whether it was geological or man-made, no one knows. In 2015, environmental changes brought the mystery back to the surface. Literally. That year, Superior's water levels dropped by nearly 2 feet due to record heat. Local photographers captured eerie images of wooden beams and stonework emerging along the shoreline near the old Onton River mouth. Geologists confirmed they were remnants of submerged structures, likely the upper floors of Altona's westernmost buildings. The revelation reignited public interest, prompting journalists to dig into the forgotten files once more. Them was NPR's American Archive program, which aired a segment titled "The County That Drowned for Power." The piece interviewed Dr. Morton, now elderly and living in Maine. Her voice, frail but steady, recounted details from her suppressed 1973 dive. "We found utensils, furniture, even children's toys. The water was clear that day. It was like looking into a frozen moment. The silt preserved everything. We had to stop when one diver found a skeletal hand protruding from a window frame. That's when I knew why they didn't want us down there." The broadcast drew national attention. For the first time, mainstream outlets acknowledged that Altona's flooding might have caused human casualties. The Corps issued a statement calling Morton's account unverified and inconsistent with historical evidence. But they offered no alternative explanation for the recovered artifacts or the photographs she briefly displayed during the interview before cutting the line. Those images have never been seen again. To piece together what really happened, one must follow 3 overlapping timelines: the official construction record, the corporate correspondence, and the personal testimonies. The official record ends cleanly. Closure achieved July 1st, 1926. power generation commenced September 1926. Success on paper. The corporate correspondence ends abruptly. Letters cease after June 20th. No documentation of final evacuation. No employee rosters. And the personal testimonies? They never stop. In 2016, an independent diver named Caleb Torrance conducted unauthorized exploration near Caraway Dam using remote-operated submersibles. He uploaded stills to an online forum before the account vanished. One image shows a half-collapsed structure with a painted sign, Rose Dry Goods. That name matches one of the families documented in Mabel Rowe's 1919 letter. The woman who wrote, "They say the water will reach the steps by Christmas." The building sits at a depth of 140 feet, its doorway intact. Torrance later told a podcaster he saw curtains still moving slightly, as if stirred by the current. When asked if he thought anyone could have survived there when the flood came, he paused and said, "No one could survive that." But they never left either. Within a month, his video channel was deleted. Officially, Altona remains a completed hydroelectric displacement project. No memorial, no marker, not even a line on modern maps. The state recognizes its existence only through old census data. Unofficially, it's a wound beneath the waterline, a reminder of what progress used to mean. Yet something else keeps drawing people back, the records that shouldn't exist. In 2019, a Freedom of Information request by historian Miriam Ortiz forced the Corps to release 15 pages of archived communications. Among them was a single redacted letter from 1927, addressed to the Secretary of War. Local authorities request clarification on post-flood accountability. Reports of remains discovered near West Basin during turbine inspection. Recommend discretion to prevent litigation. That phrase, recommend discretion, appears 6 more times in the file. Ortiz's analysis, published briefly before her server was hacked, concluded that the federal response to Altona's aftermath constituted one of the earliest environmental cover-ups in U.S. history. Her findings included witness notes from dam maintenance staff describing debris resembling domestic habitation, and a memo suggesting that portions of the lake bed were sealed with silt for aesthetic stabilization. In other words, they buried the evidence twice. But why suppress it for nearly a century? The answer lies partly in geography. Lake Superior supplies drinking water and hydroelectric regulation for much of the region. Acknowledging that a populated area lies beneath its managed zones could raise ecological and legal questions about contamination, liability, and the ethical cost of early federal projects. And then there's the cultural side. America has long celebrated its engineering triumphs: the Hoover Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the interstate system. Admitting that one of the earliest large-scale northern hydro projects drowned its own residents would tarnish that mythology. Altona wasn't just a casualty of progress. It was progress's dirty secret. The evidence keeps resurfacing, though, as if the lake itself refuses to forget. In 2021, sonar imaging from a private survey company inadvertently captured anomalies under the Superior Basin. The scans were meant to chart sediment for pipeline planning, but the operator noticed rectangular formations aligned like city grids. The company quietly reclassified the data, marking it geological irregularity. An anonymous employee leaked screenshots to a local journalist. The coordinates matched the old Altona boundary lines. 2 weeks later, The journalist's story was pulled before publication. Through all this, one thread connects every decade of discovery: the name Pierce. Lieutenant Harold Pierce, the field engineer who warned of incomplete evacuations, vanished from records in 1926. But in 2022, archivists digitizing veterans' files stumbled on an unsigned letter filed under his military ID. It's dated July 5th, 1926, 4 days after the flood began. "The valley is gone. We closed the gates too soon," Caraway insisted. "There were lights on the ridge that night, houses still occupied. We couldn't reach them. The radio orders said proceed. God help us. They'll never drain it now." No signature, but the typewriter alignment matches Pierce's earlier memos. The letter ends mid-sentence, as if torn. "If anyone ever reads this, tell them, then nothing." Modern researchers like Ortiz have tried to confirm Pierce's fate. No death certificate, no burial record. The Corps listed him transferred, but where, no one knows. Some speculate he remained near the dam, working quietly until his retirement, blending into the anonymity of government service. Others think he drowned himself in the same water he helped raise. Either way, his warning stands as the only first-hand admission of what the project cost. When you walk the southern shoreline today, you might notice the patterns: stone lines emerging through the sand after storms, fragments of porcelain, rusted nails the color of dried blood. Locals collect them as curiosities, unaware they were once pieces of someone's home. At the small county museum in Superior Township, there's a display case labeled Relics of the Lost County. Inside are a child's shoe, a cracked dinner plate, and a Bible swollen from years underwater. The tag below reads, "Recovered near Caraway Dam, 1978. Origin uncertain." But anyone who's followed the trail knows exactly where they came from. In the end, the investigation into Altona isn't about proving the town existed. That part is undeniable. It's about confronting how easily a place, a people, and their history can be erased when progress demands silence. Each fragment of evidence, Pierce's memos, Mabel Rowe's letters, Morton's dive notes, Holloway's footage, forms a mosaic that reveals more than a drowned county. It reveals a pattern, America's willingness to bury its mistakes and call the burial advancement. And somewhere beneath that endless expanse of blue, the foundations of Belford still stand, unchanged, unmoving, waiting. The lake may have taken the land, but it couldn't take the truth. It only hid it, waiting for someone to dive deep enough to listen. The deeper we dig into the story of the vanished county, the more it feels less like history and more like a confession. A century after the flood, the truth that was buried under Lake Superior's surface began to rise again, not in waves of water, but in waves of evidence. Pages, photographs, letters that had survived only because someone, somewhere, refused to throw them away. It began when a quiet historian named Elias Corwin filed a Freedom of Information request. He didn't expect anyone to answer. He was researching mercury contamination, not mysteries. But what he found in a mislabeled archive file changed everything. The document was stamped OIT Val Archive number 2196, and inside was a memo written 2 years after the flooding of Altona County. The type was faint, the paper brittle, but the words were clear enough to raise the dead. Recommend closure of investigation regarding deceased occupants discovered during turbine maintenance. Notification not required per 1926 exemption clause. The initials at the bottom were HDP, the same ones that had haunted researchers for decades. Harold D. Pierce, the field engineer who'd warned that the evacuation was incomplete. That single page confirmed what every rumor had whispered. When the water came, not everyone was gone. Corwin published his findings quietly in a university journal. For 3 weeks, it sat online unnoticed. Then the article vanished, the page replaced by a blank gray screen. But copies had already spread, shared by archivists, students, and the descendants of the people who once lived in that drowned valley. The silence was breaking. That summer, divers returned to the lake with cameras that streamed live to the internet. They weren't funded by television networks or universities, but by donations from people who wanted to see if their grandparents' homes were really down there. Among them was Caleb Torrance, the diver whose earlier footage had been seized years before. Now, he came back with new equipment and a simple plan: to broadcast everything in real time so no one could make it disappear. They launched at dawn on July 1st, 2024, 98 years to the day since the floodgates had closed. The lake was glassy, the wind low, the horizon wrapped in mist. When the remote camera slipped beneath the surface, the viewers saw blue give way to black. At 40 feet, fish scattered across the lens. At 100, the light dimmed to gray. And then, out of the murk, shapes began to appear. Right angles, lines too straight to be natural. Torrance's voice crackled through the feed, low, disbelieving. "We're over Belford. The sign's still here." The camera turned, and there it was, half buried in silt. The same rusted welcome sign the university team had raised back in 1973. It had somehow found its way back to the lake bed, as if the water refused to let it leave. The ROV drifted forward, headlights slicing through drifting sediment. Walls appeared, then windows, then the shadow of a church tower leaning like a broken mast. Inside one building, light caught something metallic, a wooden crate sealed with rusted hinges, the letters on its lid just visible. Corpse Supply Evac Kit Number 4. The camera arm reached out and brushed away the debris. Under the grime, a name was stenciled faintly in black: Lieutenant H.D. Pierce. They brought the crate to the surface, the wood swelling as air touched it for the first time in almost a century. Inside were waterlogged rations, a pair of boots, a corroded compass, and a small notebook wrapped in oilskin. When they opened it, the pages clung together like skin, but the handwriting was still legible, Pierce's careful script from 1926. The entries began methodically, each one dated, timed, and signed like a soldier's log. June 28th. They've accelerated to Friday. Too soon. Cannot clear Zone 3 before closure. Then, June 29th. Rain again. Civilians still in valley. Caraway says the water rises tomorrow. The final line, written with the ink pressed so hard it cut the page, read, "Belford still alive when the water came." Those words hit like thunder. For decades, no one had been able to prove that lives were lost when the dam sealed. Now, there was proof, in the handwriting of the man who built it. When the notebook's discovery reached the news, the Army Corps issued a short defensive statement. "We have found no evidence of malfeasance or loss of life." But within weeks, that stance began to crumble. Independent labs authenticated the ink, the paper, and the sealant. Everything matched 1926. Under public pressure, the Corps announced an internal review, though its findings were classified before anyone outside the agency could read them. Still, the story spread. Corwin connected the notebook to energy reports from the same week, showing the dam generating power one day earlier than scheduled. The water had been raised before the evacuation finished. Pierce's nightmare in black and white. As the truth broke open, the descendants of Altona's families gathered on the shoreline with photographs and candles. The lake reflected hundreds of tiny flames that trembled like ghosts over the water. A man named Edward LaRue, grandson of the last mayor, stood in front of the cameras and said, "My grandfather told them not to close it yet. He said the county wasn't empty. They didn't listen then. They'll listen now." Within months, petitions reached the governor's office. Historians, environmental groups, and ordinary citizens demanded that the state acknowledge what had happened, that a county had drowned not by disaster, but by design. In early 2025, the governor signed an executive order officially recognizing Altona County, 1883 to 1926, as a lost municipality and declaring the site a protected memorial zone. A floating marker was anchored above the approximate location of Belford's courthouse. Etched into its steel rim were the names of documented residents. On calm days, the reflection of those names shimmers beneath the surface. Each letter doubled. The living above, the memory below. The acknowledgement did more than correct a map. It cracked open a silence older than anyone alive. Schools across Michigan began teaching the story in environmental history courses. Engineers studying dam ethics cited it as the case that forced America to remember the human cost of its own progress. The Pierce notebook became a permanent exhibit, its replica displayed beside the recovered crate in a museum overlooking the lake. For years, the statue of Walter Carraway, the man who built the dam, had stood at its entrance, his bronze face gazing proudly toward the turbines. After the revelation, locals draped it in black cloth. Months later, workers quietly removed it, replacing the base with a plaque that reads, "Progress without remembrance is erasure." Yet the story refused to end there. That autumn, the Corps authorized a final survey of the reservoir, citing structural assessment. They invited independent observers, including Torrance and Corwin, to ensure transparency. For the first time in nearly a century, the agency agreed to dive where it had always said no one could go. On a gray morning in September 2025, the team descended along the northern ridge where sonar hinted at cavities below the lake bed. The remote vehicle crept through a tangle of beams until its lights found an arched opening, a church basement, perfectly preserved. Inside, water pressure had carved an air pocket the size of a room. Floating inside that bubble were wooden pews, hymnals sealed in silt, and a small tin box resting on a stone ledge. Engraved on its lid, in letters uneven but deliberate, were the words, "To whom it may concern, we are still here." When they opened it, they found family photographs, a church registry, and a Bible swollen with water. The page that lay open bore Psalm 69. "Save me, O God, for the waters are come in unto my soul." The crew said nothing. Even the engineers who'd spent their careers defending the project stood silent. Outside, the sky cleared, and a column of sunlight broke through the clouds, striking the lake in a perfect circle above them, as if the surface itself was listening. In the months that followed, the discovery ignited a national conversation about forgotten communities sacrificed to infrastructure. Historians connected Altona to dozens of other towns drowned for reservoirs, places with names like Hetch Hetchy, Tellico, and Monticello. Altona became the symbol of them all, the story that finally forced the country to admit what progress had cost. Urban planning courses now teach the Altona principle, that no project is worth more than the memory of the people beneath it. And yet, every few years, proposals for new hydro schemes appear on congressional dockets, echoing the same language Caraway used a century ago: power, growth, necessity. The lesson is fragile, easily drowned again. Still, the lake remembers. When water levels drop in dry summers, pieces of the old county reappear. Brick corners, iron rail ties, shards of glass that glint like stars beneath the waves. Fishermen pull them up in their nets and leave them on the docks, small monuments from a vanished world. The Caraway Dam still hums, its turbines feeding electricity into the grid, a mechanical heartbeat over the silence below. At night, when the wind dies and the surface goes still, locals say you can hear faint bells beneath the water, 3 slow chimes that echo the last hour the courthouse clock ever struck. Scientists blame shifting metal in the turbine shafts, but those who know the story just nod and listen. As for Walter Caraway himself, his legacy ended long before his dam stopped running. His company collapsed within a year of completion, buried under lawsuits and debt. He died in 1941 in a Minneapolis boarding house, leaving behind one letter no one read until it surfaced in an attic in 2020. In it, he wrote, "I stand by what we built. If the price was high, so be it. America needed light." But the light he gave came at the cost of a county's shadow. Harold Pierce's descendants were the ones who finally cleared his name. They funded the expedition that recovered his notebook, proving he had tried to stop the disaster. On the centennial of the flood, they gathered at the memorial buoy with hundreds of others. As dawn broke, they read his words aloud: "Belford still alive when the water came." Their voices carried across the lake until the last syllable faded into the wind. The water looked calm that morning, smooth as glass. Beneath it lay streets, door frames, a courthouse clock, and the lives of 1,000 Suwutin people who never thought the world would forget them. And maybe at last, it hasn't. Because some stories refuse to sink. They wait in the dark, patient as pressure, until the weight of truth forces them upward. When they finally breach the surface, the world has no choice but to look. If you stand there now, on the overlook above the dam, where the wind smells of iron and pine, you can see sunlight glancing off the waves. For a moment, the glare shapes itself into lines, streets, corners, a grid that vanishes the instant you blink. It's as if the lake is exhaling memory, letting the past shimmer before swallowing it again. History books may list Altona County as an administrative footnote, a jurisdiction dissolved in 1926. But those who've seen the footage know better. The county still exists, suspended in time, beneath hundreds of feet of cold, superior water. The walls remain. The furniture waits. Even the welcome sign, now displayed in a museum, carries the stain of silt that never quite washes off. Some nights, I imagine the lights below, lanterns swaying on invisible streets, and wonder whether they belong to the past or to something that refuses to die until it's finally understood. The truth is that America didn't lose Altona to water. It buried it to hide the cost of its own ambition. But water has a way of revealing what land cannot keep secret. Pressure preserves, silence amplifies, and time, like the lake, remembers everything. Standing there, listening to the turbine's endless hum, you realize the sound isn't just machinery. It's history, turning beneath the surface, reminding anyone who dares to listen that progress always leaves an echo. And if you listen closely enough, long after the wind has died and the last wave has settled, you might just hear it. The faint toll of a bell, rising through the dark, counting the moments we still owe to the ones left behind. If this story moved you, subscribe for more American historical mysteries, forgotten events, and hidden secrets like this one.